Well, hi and welcome everybody. I'm Lisa Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence, and here in my capacity as an ambassador to the International Mentoring Association board. I'm thrilled to be here today with David Clutterbuck to have a conversation about his expertise and interest in mentoring. I want to tell you just a little bit about him before we dive in. David Clutterbuck is really one of the early pioneers of developmental coaching and mentoring, and he's a co-founder of the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. He's author of more than 70 books, including the first evidence-based titles on coaching culture and team coaching. As the author of just one myself, I know how much hard work goes into it, so 70 really is quite an accomplishment. And he's a visiting professor at 4 business schools. He leads a global network of specialist mentoring and coaching training consultants, which is Coaching and Mentoring International. David, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So excited to talk to you about your own work and scholarship and mentoring. I'm hoping we can start with what led to your own PhD study in mentoring.
I was a journalist for McGraw-Hill and eventually left McGraw-Hill to set out on my own ventures when it was pointed out to me that I wasn't going to go any further in McGraw-Hill. I was the most senior non-American in the organization, and basically they wouldn't have any, there was no progress for me because above that level, I either had to become a naturalized American, live in New York, or that was it. So I went off and set up my own ventures. Before I did that, I met a wonderful lady called Kathy Cram.
Sure.
And Kathy was doing her PhD research. I visited her in Boston to talk about it. And I came back and got really enthused by this whole area. And I think it was probably in the same month in 1985 that we brought out our books. So her book on her based on her PhD study was it 28 informal pairs, and mine based upon lots of interviews with people in both informal and informal programs in primarily in Europe, although some in the States. So that was really how the two models of mentoring really began to evolve, because there's a very much an American model which seems to be based upon something of a deviation from the original interpretation of mentoring. Let's put it that way, because it conflates sponsorship with mentoring. And in my PhD, one of the things that came across was these two things are different constructs, which are actually inimical, because one is about I need to look good in front of you so that you'll do things for me, and the other is about I can be having real, honest, and open conversation with you. So there's some big issues around that. Yeah. But I think at that stage things started to deviate quite strongly, and going back into the European origins of mentoring, and of course it comes originally, the word comes from Greece, and from the Odyssey. What we learn very quickly is that there are the real mentor was, of course, the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And in the Odyssey, she's got various other characters. She's a split personality. She's also the goddess of martial arts, who's a bloodthirsty witch, who's anything but wise. And I think the conflation of these two things is it's unfortunate, because but when she's in her persona as the goddess of wisdom, acting as mentor, she is basically having conversations with Odysseus and his son, young Telemachus, to help them become wiser. So we describe mentoring as using your wisdom to help somebody else become wiser in turn. And the history of mentoring then rolls forward into the court of King Louis XVI, the Sun King, and his horrible little brat of a son, who is put in the charge of a cleric called Fénelon. And Fénelon's job is to turn this young person into a human being, into a person fit to become king. And he does this by sitting down and having lots and lots of dialogues with him in exactly the same way that Athena did. He has an experience, you talk about it, you help him to learn from that experience and reflect upon it. And what actually happened was Fénelon wrote some stories to help the young prince, and somebody stole them and published them. And that didn't go down too well with the king, who thought it was all a criticism of him. So Fénelon got fired. But the books went absolutely, they just went out viral across Europe. And and that's really the origins of mentoring in Europe are very much a non-directive conversation to help somebody become wiser. Which is very different from the sponsorship model that we see so often in the States, which is about giving advice. And I think what we would say is in both coaching and mentoring, which are very similar, but we have lots of similarities, although coaching only actually dates back to 1851 when it was created as a joke. A bunch of students going back to university. I've got this high-powered tutor. He's just like our carriage that's taking us back. He's going to drag us through our exams. And the carriage was an expensive one from Hungary called a coach, and that's where coaching came from. So coaching, right up until the fairly recent times, until the end of the 1990s, was almost always a directive activity. And it was only with the work of Timothy Galway in 1974 that it started to move away from directive towards non-directive. Whereas mentoring in its pure traditional form has always been a non-directive issue. So where all this led me to was I'd been writing about this. I'd sort of become very well known in particularly in Europe and the Far East and so forth for around mentoring. So lots of people were following what I was doing, and suddenly, and I wanted to do a PhD. I had a D.Lit already, but that wasn't much hard work. So I spent actually 10 years doing my PhD, and the starting point for this was saying, well, okay, what do we really need to know? So we hadn't got a decent longitudinal cross-sectional study of mentoring. So what actually happens? So I designed a study that would take what eventually about 80 pairs of mentors and mentees and follow them through 3 stages of the relationship, measuring the quality of the relationship and what actually happened in the relationship in great depth. And of course, I needed lots more than 80 pairs because so many of them didn't go all the way through. So that's one of the reasons why it took so long. The other reason was basically that I had to design because all the questionnaires, like Kathy's questionnaires and others, were all based upon this sponsorship model, which didn't work in a European context. So I had to develop all of the diagnostics myself and then test them out. So I actually probably did about 3 PhDs in one.
Well, I can't wait to get my hands on it and read it, but I have a lot of questions for you based on what we've talked about so far. So when you did this really broad study, what did you find as the characteristics of the most successful mentoring pairs through that study?
I think through that study, we didn't do an analysis of the most successful pairs in that way, but we've done lots of other research around that. It's interesting that one of the characteristics that comes out very strongly is humility on the part, particularly of the mentor. I mean, that's the one. And the trouble with Kathy's functions of a mentor is that they're all sorts of things. Friendship is not a skill. Whereas, so you've got lots of things in here, and it was perfectly reasonable to call them functions because they were a bundle of things that you would observe in a mentor. And I think we're always caught up in this thing. What is it that mentors do, and what is it that mentors are? And we constantly find both the research and our attempts to really pin down mentoring get caught in these two things. We have to accept that mentors both do and are.
I love that. So say a little bit more about what you mean by humility.
Well, it's basically about being prepared to listen to other people. It's about accepting that you're a work in progress, that you haven't actually arrived. So it's having this balance between not being sufficiently self-critical on the one level, but not arrogant. And so so there's a spectrum of terribly of having imposter syndrome or terribly self-critical and arrogant the other. So it's somewhere it's in the middle. and we've been doing quite a lot of work. I did a non-empirical study. I just for fun, when they started to gather loads and loads of articles, and Google Scholar's always very helpful at these things, and books. And so, what in the last since we've moved to a more modern thought concept of leadership and a more modern concept of coaching. So since I think we started about 2002, looking back to the literature, I said, okay, what are the themes that keep coming up for great coaches and great leaders? And you can extrapolate to great mentors at the same time from this. There wasn't the breadth of literature for be able to do this for mentors. But we came up with 4 qualities that seem to be echoed time and time again, recurring themes, if you like. And so often happens these things, we were able to bung them into the same acronym, same letter at the front. And the first one was compassion. And as you see, these all seem to link to the humility theme. So compassion, and the key to compassion is for other people is being compassionate towards yourself. And I love to ask coaches and mentors, what could you forgive yourself for today? Or how could you be kind to yourself? Then there's curiosity, and that's really wanting to understand the world through the other person's eyes. How do they make sense? What is it like to be in their shoes? Something that I realized a while ago in attending a lecture on the neuroscience of psychopathy. And somehow the question came out, what must it be like, how terrible it must be to go through life never being able to love another human being? Puts the whole concept of psychopathy into a completely different league. That's curiosity and compassion combined. Then there's courage, the ability to ask those difficult questions, or to face up to the conversations that nobody wants to have but need to be had. And one of the things that I find as a mentor, time and time again, we ask people, so what is the conversation that's waiting to be had here? And then the last one that came out of, didn't come out of that study at all. It came out of taking it around the world and taking it into Africa. And we were immediately said, a whole bunch of people said, you're missing the 4th C. It's connectedness.
Oh, fantastic.
And in Africa, they have this concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And there's so much depth in this. And I think if you apply those qualities to a mentor, you've got something really powerful.
I 100% agree. 100% agree. This concept of Ubuntu is so powerful. And in fact, when I was working in the corporate world and leading diversity and inclusion, I flipped the concept of Ubuntu to teach people about this idea of connectedness and what it is to have inclusion and connectedness in the workplace, to we are because I am, which is also equally powerful. Right?
Lovely, that's lovely.
What is the collective because of who we are as an individual? I'm also so I feel a connection, not to double up on my la entendre here, but to this idea of curiosity. There's a book that came out through an article that came out through the Harvard Business Review. I think it was 2018, fall of 2018, by Francesca Gina, talking about curiosity being the biggest predictor of success in leadership. I think it's been undervalued for so long. It's certainly something in mentoring and coaching that's really important. So David, you've talked a lot about this intersection of mentoring and coaching, and how particularly in the European model, there is significant overlap. What about them sort of falls outside of that connection? So if you were to differentiate between the two, how are they dissimilar?
It's really nuanced. Because what actually happened in Europe, we had the European Mentoring Coaching Council, and then which we set up in '92. So it's the oldest of the professional bodies in the field. And then we found all these people calling themselves coaches who were saying that who were saying, well, no, hang on, you're not doing you're doing mentoring or coaching. So they got the whole thing mixed. We were saying, well, we're doing the same sort of things with some overlaps. Let's actually combine. And that's how the EMCC was actually created as the EMCC in 1999. But I think where the overlap, where the differences lie most, is the primary emphasis on coaching is about what you want to achieve, whereas the primary emphasis of mentoring is who do you want to become. And although that's a very simplistic difference between the two, I think it's quite a powerful one. As a coach, we're helping. We may help somebody develop skills. We may help them develop greater insights into what's going on inside them. But as a mentor, we may have put more emphasis on the external world. In fact, one of the ways we look at both coaching and mentoring is to say there are three circles here, concentric circles. The inner circle is understanding yourself. Who am I? My strengths, my weaknesses, my values, my fears, my aspirations. And then there's an outer circle, which is what's going on in the world around me. What are the opportunities for me? Who actually wants me to succeed? And so forth. What are the threats to my career? And what coaching and mentoring both do is sit in the middle circle and create the opportunity to link those internal conversations with the external conversations. And that's really the core of all coaching and mentoring. Yeah. You might say that there is a bit more emphasis in coaching on the internal dimension and a bit more emphasis in mentoring on the external. But to a large extent, that's driven by the fact that mentors tend to have that extra amount of understanding of the world that you're working in, so that they can use that to craft better questions, to empathize more with where you're coming from, but not to give advice.
That's super powerful. The other piece that really resonates with me of what you're saying is this difference between sponsorship and mentoring. And you're quite right, obviously, that here in the States, we conflate those two far too often. And in fact, it's a question that I get a lot, because about a year or so ago, there was an article that came out. I forget the publication, but it was quite well circulated. Get a sponsor, not a mentor. Yeah, essentially. And so I get a lot of questions, particularly among folks who are underrepresented in the workplace, women, people of color, LGBTQ, and so forth, about which should I do? Should I get a sponsor or a mentor? And of course, my answer is yes. You need a sponsor and a mentor, right? They're two different things. Absolutely. And one of the things that you said so stuck with me, David, and I'd not thought of it before, is this idea of if you're conflating the two, you, as the mentee or the sponsee, there's so much more of a likelihood of this sense of imposter syndrome, because you're going to show up as the person you think your sponsor wants you to be, because they're going to be advocating for you. They're going to be presenting these opportunities. And so that's really very powerful.
Yeah. Well, one of the companies that we've worked with for years has had mentors for mentoring programs for probably 10, 15 years. And in the last 2 or 3 years, it's also started to do sponsorship programs as well. Mm-hmm. Particularly for women in junior and middle management wanting to go up a grade. And so the way that it works is that they all have their mentors, but now they have a sponsor in addition. The two roles don't overlap at all. They don't even talk to each other about the individual. But the sponsor's role is very, very specific. Over the course of a year, they will make sure that the sponsee, or whatever we want to call them, is given the opportunity and the exposure to key developmental opportunities, so project teams and so forth. And so it's an additional element which brings them to the notice of other people in the top team, gives them that exposure that they need, and allows them to just show what they can do. And I think that's the way that we need to be working with them. We need to have mentoring and sponsorship in certain circumstances. Many people don't need a sponsor, but actually it's quite nice to have one from time to time.
For sure. What do you see as the essential attribute of a good sponsor?
Gosh, that's a really good question. And the reason I'm hesitating is because there are so many. I think the key is to have a clear understanding of the sponsee's agenda, rather than your own, or their line managers or somebody else's. But it's about the experience, what they need to be exposed to, which they may not know, of course. And so, and you are going to use your influence on their behalf. So you want to be very clear about why and how you're going to do that.
Yeah. So it's interesting because really I can start to see using your model of concentric circles, David, that the sponsor lives in that external realm of and the job of a mentor is to help the mentee figure out how he or she wants to present to that sponsor so they can run the ball, so to speak, in that circle. That's really terrific. Well, I wish we had more time on that subject, but I want to switch to a couple other things. How do you see mentoring making a difference in the world?
It's all, I mean, it has done for many years, but there are so many different applications of mentoring that we see now. One that's had enormous impact in Europe and Australia and elsewhere is maternity mentoring, and indeed paternity mentoring too. So people that go off for 9 months, a year or more to have a child, and then come back into the workplace. Well, firstly, most of them don't come back to the old job, and that's a real waste. But if you create have a maternity mentoring program, most of them will, and they will get settled in much more quickly. So Asda, which is part of Walmart, has been doing this. Was one of the pioneers in the UK in recent years. It's a very powerful way of supporting these people. Now, I know in the States, you basically you're expected to take your laptop into the delivery room with you and come straight out and go straight back to work or something like that. Anyway, but
just pretty close. Pretty close.
Yeah, not far off.
Been there, done that twice. Yeah.
But I mean, even if it's only a few weeks that you're away, there is a re-entry 100% issue here, and you're a new person. If it's your first child, you're a different person when you come back through that office door, and so I think there's a real emphasis for that. We've got massive programs of ethical mentoring. We've trained over 200 ethical mentors in the National Health Service in the UK, and the concept here, it comes out of programs that we ran in the financial services sector over a decade ago now. When the crash of 2009 happened, all the catastrophes there, it was felt that one of the answers would be, who do people turn to when there's an ethical dilemma, when they see things that are wrong but nobody will listen to them? And so what basically an ethical mentor does is to help, they have an understanding of the psychology of ethicality, and they have a toolkit to help people think through how they are going, what they're going to do about a particular issue in a way that doesn't harm them and doesn't harm the organization. I think it's a really powerful and valuable area that we can see developing. We're also seeing in countries like Poland a big movement away from away from coaching, but people who are very experienced executives retiring want to become mentors, not coaches, because they want to be valued for their expertise, but they don't want to become consultants. So these people are beginning to change the world as well. Just so many other things. There's a whole movement now for climate change mentoring.
Tell me more about that. What's climate change mentoring?
It's a new initiative, but the idea is that people who are going to be working with government or with companies or elsewhere, somebody that can actually help people think in a much more extensive and an inclusive way than just about business objectives. So it's a sort of moral guide, if you like, but we're particularly focused around climate change. So this is something that's developing at the moment, and we'll see where it gets to. And I've got this big project which we've been testing out the materials for, which is to create 5 million school-age coaches and mentors across the world.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what would they do?
Well, the idea is that companies all over the world spend a fortune trying to re-educate people in their 30s and 40s to become to become mentors or coaches, often failing dismally. Um, and what we're saying is that if young people can enter the workforce with these skills, then that's great for the companies. But also, of course, it means that they're going to be able to find mentors when they need them more easily. They're going to be able to be able to take much more control of their careers. And there's so many benefits from the self-awareness that comes from being a coach or a mentor. And so we've been experimenting with materials now. We're going to move into the next phase later this year. COVID has knocked everything for six, of course. Mm-hmm. But we're looking to foundations to actually fund getting this out to the massive schools that we've been using as the trials, and making it much more global. I mean, if I give you a sense of a school in I think Jakarta, is it Jakarta or is it no? It's in Kuala Lumpur. Here they've got the district, which is really poor, one of the most deprived areas of the city, and all they've done is to put in this program and train a bunch of the kids to be coaches and mentors to each other. In 2018, they had 8 kids expelled. 2019, none.
Wow.
That's the kind of change we're trying to make.
Oh, that speaks to the power of accountability. It speaks to the power of creating a culture of learning and development. I love that. The other thing that I find so exciting about that is you think about the long-term impact, and when these kids enter the workforce, of the kind of culture that they will be creating, and I think significantly the kind of culture they'll be looking for as they become the best kind of talent and demanding, that's super powerful. That's super powerful. That's great.
That's young.
Get them young. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So you asked a really powerful question before that you suggested this powerful question that a mentor or a coach can be asking. And I want to end with asking you this question in the mentoring context. You said, what is the conversation that is waiting to be had? And yes. I want to ask you that question in the context of mentoring. What's the conversation that's waiting to be had in mentoring?
There are multiple conversations. But I think part of what one conversation is what we've been having. How can mentoring make a bigger difference? And we're doing some research into politics at the moment, and on politicized environments, and the role of coaching and mentoring there. And again, if we can encourage people to be open and honest, even in a politicized environment, we can make an enormous, and the best place to be safe, to be open and honest, is in a mentoring relationship. Mm-hmm. And fascinating, we have one case study of a local councillor, sort of, I don't know what to call it in the States, but a town council, where the elected representatives come from 3 main parties. When you're a new councillor, you get a mentor from another party. Can you imagine that Democrats and Republicans mentoring each other? But if you can think of the positive impact that would have, I think it's something that we should be standing up and demanding. But whether we'll see it in a polarized environment is another matter. But it's just a totally different way of thinking about things. I mean, I wish I had more examples like that one. We're looking at the ripple effect. So we're going to do a study this year. One of the conversation we don't know is what actually is the impact. You've trained one person as a mentor. How far does that ripple? Do the people, how many other people do they go on to mentor outside that first mentoring relationship? The people that they mentor, who do they go on to become mentors to? And we really want to get a handle on this. what is what is the ripple effect, and how can we make it stronger? How can we chuck bigger rocks into the pool?
It's so interesting because, the obvious ripples to measure are where the mentoring relationships extend to, but there are smaller ripples or maybe even invisible ripples in terms of the competencies that they develop as better
Yeah.
listeners, in terms of their, emotional intelligence, and
Yeah.
other things as well. That's really, really, really huge. Really huge.
Well, there's something that we constantly have conversations with people about creating a coaching culture in their organization, or getting line managers to be coaches. And we say back to them, well, actually, it's very difficult for a line manager to take that step and to behave differently in it, to experiment and be adventurous in the developmental conversations they have with their direct reports, because there's so much hanging on them getting it right. But make them a mentor. Let them experiment in developmental conversations with people who are outside of their immediate circle, so that they can there's less risk. If you want to have coaching behaviors in an organization, if you want to create coaching cultures, start with mentoring.
Beautiful, beautiful. It does feel less risky, doesn't it? It feels less intimidating to the potential coach, potential mentor, as well. It's fantastic. Fantastic.
We sometimes talk about there's the word mentor. Of course, there's tormentor, which are the really bad ones. Yes. There's from Harry Potter. We've got dementor, who suck all the life out of you. But I like fermentor.
Fermentor, okay.
Yeah. So the fur is the Latin or French for steel. So this is not it's not just a nice cuddly relationship. The ment is about thinking, and the awe is about creating alternatives you didn't know existed.
That's great. I love that. It's so needed. This idea of challenge, maybe this correlates with the C you used was courage,
Yeah.
right? Is so important. It's really what we need as a society right now, not just here in the States, but elsewhere, of this idea of how do you create a safe and courageous space for that kind of challenge, where you get the knowing and the learning that complement one another. That's super powerful. Super powerful. Wow. This world you are envisioning is one that I want to jump right into, David. There's some great stuff. Thank you so much. Any final words or final thoughts you want to share with the folks who are watching?
I just think you just mentioned a word which I think is a really important one in this whole context, which is power. Yeah. And if you come into a mentoring relationship carrying power with you, that's always going to make it less psychologically safe. But if you can leave the power behind and be human beings, and this is where curiosity comes in, because you're truly curious about the other person. You want to see things from their perspective. You don't want to impose yours on them. And I think that's one of the things that we've tried hard to import from Europe into the States, is this notion of mentoring as a power-free relationship.
Power-free. Beautiful.
And I think the whole point about that is then that the power of the mentoring relationship is the energy and the potential that it releases, because it's not being driven by power from outside.
Wonderful final thought. David, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. I know I'm inspired, and I know that the folks who are watching this are inspired as well. Really appreciate your time.
That's a pleasure. It's always good that the IMA it's been around for a fair few years, hasn't it? And it's got a lot of potential still to do tremendous things to support people, and basically to carry the torch for mentoring. We can make a really big change in the world, and we've only just started.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Lisa.
So before we go, David, how can folks find you?
They can find me through my personal website, which is David Clutterbuck Partnership, or coachingandmentoringinternational.org. Both organizations. But if you want to come to me directly, the easiest way to do it is david@davidclutterbuckpartnership.com, and that'll always get to me. And I do read and answer all my emails, although it takes quite a lot of time these days.
Wonderful. Well, we'll make sure to add the final slide with that information, and also it's in the notes below this video on our YouTube channel as well.
Brilliant.